Hi and welcome. I'm Marcus Breen and you're watching Boston Media Theory. Welcome to another episode. Today we're continuing the great project of exploring media theory and those who work in and around it as researchers, practitioners, critics if you like, in Boston. And today I'm delighted to welcome Professor William Gamson from Boston College, who is a long-term sociologist, a lifelong career as a sociologist. And some people might say, well, hold on, isn't this Boston media theory? How does that work? Well, we'll find out as we progress. So welcome, Bill, to the episode and to the NewTV. And I want to start by outlining a little bit of your trajectory, which is you started at the University of Michigan in your career. Is that correct?
Yes, I guess.
You guess? And then you don't want to give too much praise.
I did my graduate work there.
You did your graduate work there? Okay. And then quite a long time ago you moved to Boston.
Well, my immediate first job was in Boston after I got my PhD from Michigan. I came to Boston to the Harvard School of Public Health. There was a media project in the Harvard School of Public Health, and I had an appointment in the Department of Social Relations at the time. So
okay, and then
I spent 3 years in Cambridge.
Okay. And then they let you cross the river. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, one of the points that I think we should celebrate, of course, in your long and esteemed career is that you were the president, is that right, or the chairperson of the American Sociological Association?
Yeah, I was the president in 1994, yes.
1994, and that usually signifies something, not only authority, but also a relevance to the field, would you say?
I think so.
And was it a particular moment where media was especially important to sociologists, or was that not the case?
Well, I think that it became more and more important in the 80s and in the 90s. There became more of a consciousness of it, and partly it was around the idea of framing.
Right. Okay. Well, we're going to talk about that as your significant contribution to the field, along with social movement studies or social movement theory. So let's start with framing theory. Within the field of media and media studies in particular, but sociology, there's a number of reasonably esoteric theories that need some description. So as a significant contributor to the development of framing theory, can you describe for the audience and also for me how you see it from this distance?
Yes, well, when I started with the idea of frame, I realized that there were different meanings of framing. There was framing as in a picture frame, and framing as in a kind of organizing idea. And I thought that the idea was really important because it put boundaries around what one saw, and those boundaries also had the characteristic of omitting things that were not in the boundaries. So it not only focused you and helped you to see certain things, but it also blinded you and made it difficult to see other things. I like the idea, and I especially the idea that it sort of organized and determined what was relevant and what was not relevant. So I tried to incorporate that idea into framing and frames as a tool of social movements.
Okay.
Because one of the tasks of social movements was to focus one's attention on certain things, and frames were a way of doing that. I think there was a later development that became very important, which was linking frames to narratives, to storytelling. And frames highlighted certain things, and they felt that they were a powerful device for organizing one's thinking. on social movements, and that one needed to analyze social movements in terms of what frames they were using.
Sure. And so clearly the whole idea of a frame organises your thinking about what's in the picture and what's out of the picture.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good way of putting it, because a lot of the, I think a crucial element of this idea was the notion of a framing contest.
Oh yeah.
That adversaries were offering rival frames. So there wasn't that much interest in what they all called attention to, because those were non-controversial. But the fact that this frame called attention to this aspect of the issue and this other frame ignored it was a battleground. And there were forums on which this battle was taking place, and the mass media was the crucial forum.
Sure.
Because it had a general audience, and you could see which frame was doing which frame was doing best, essentially, by seeing what was being featured in the mass media forum. So a lot of my early analyses were around what was being singled out and featured in the media, and which frames that they favored.
Does that mean that one of the jobs of an analyst and a theoretician in this media environment is to play an important role in telling people what's left out, or what the frame is, and then what's not being told?
Yes, I think that is an implication of this. That often the crucial task for a movement is to bring into consciousness and salience those things that are important to that frame for understanding the issue that are being neglected by the mass media. And there are biases in the media, since I've talked about the balance norm, and the fact that the balance norm assumes that there are two sides here, and the two sides tend to be represented by the major political parties and so forth. So that if what you're trying to emphasize is not one of the salient facts that the two sides are, I mean, it's really hard to break into the media with that.
Yes, I'm sure. And in fact, it's a bit like the old Tweedledum and Tweedledee idea, isn't it? That they're, in a sense, not really very different. If you think about the lack of conflict that really often happens within the media reproducing similar stories or the same story over and over.
There were arguments that the fact that the parties looked like Tweedledum and Tweedledee was a sign of health, because the parties were trying to locate themselves on the mode of a distribution, and that meant you emphasized the center.
Right.
So the party, if there was a trend and you were slow to pick it up, and the other party picked it up first, then you would lose out on it, and was part of the analysis of what happened in the Goldwater-Johnson election in 1964, and McGovern, and so forth.
Well, that was my next question before we move maybe back to describing the application of framing theory, and that is, did your approach and conceptualization of the frame emerge in a particular context? Was it influenced by that particular set of politics, or the Vietnam War, or something when you were thinking and working through in grad school?
Well, I think there was certainly the opposition to the Vietnam War was a central theme, and I think we were already using the idea of framing in those days, and the ways in which certain facts had to be sort of brought to light, and there were incidents in which there were major framing contests, the Bay of Tonkin incident being one of the most prominent, where a major framing contest was going on, and I know that I was very much influenced in my own work by by I.F. Stone, Izzy Stone,
Oh, right.
analysis in February 1965 of what was being left out of the debate, and the whole teach-in movement, I think, was sort of influenced by an effort to bring into the discussion the aspects that were being neglected or distorted in some cases.
Okay, so can you describe what the teach-in movement, or what teach-ins were for our younger viewers and those who maybe don't have a political knowledge of what this importance was?
Well, yes, I mean, it was, we really were trying to raise consciousness about what was happening and to challenge the distortions of the Johnson administration and so forth about what was going on. So we were trying to bring to light new things, and our original plan of the teach-in was to call off our classes during the day and to have focus on the war, because part of the inspiration was not to go on with business as usual. It was actually inspired by the idea of freedom schools in the Boston area, who had a positive. I remember being struck by the fact that there was a positive aspect to the protest. It wasn't simply calling off classes, but they held alternative classes on Black history. And that seemed like a good model to me, that it was not just a negative protest, but building in a positive way. So we invited, well, originally we had McGeorge Bundy scheduled to participate, and he dropped out, but that was in the national teach-in in Washington. So the teach-in in Michigan was in March, and then there was a follow-up national teach-in in Washington in June.
Right. So teach-ins really were a way of acknowledging the frame that limited information, and then taking the opportunity to say, well, we are going to reframe the discussion, or basically educate?
Yes.
I mean,
the term about raising consciousness was used. I always have been a little uncomfortable with that term because, it assumes that one knows more than the other person about what's in their interests, which has a sort of arrogance about it. But there certainly was a lack of awareness of many aspects of what was going on, and deliberate lying and deceit, which I think we exposed a lot of that.
Sure. And the interesting thing about the resistance to the Vietnam War was, not only was it one of the very original sites where real media activism took place. I don't know what you think of this, but the idea that media, television reports of the Vietnam War changed public opinion, and that sort of reorchestrated, if you like, a different way of seeing the world. Right?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think there was a feeling of success in really bringing into the debate all sorts of issues that had been hidden, and so it got a lot of attention and publicity. And interestingly enough, we got, after we made a change in our original plan of not calling off our classes during the day, but instead meeting all night.
Oh, really?
We started it in the evening, and we met. The university cooperated. They were grateful.
Which university is this?
They gave us the rooms.
Which university?
University of Michigan.
Oh, okay. All right.
And one of the important things they did was they suspended parietal hours for women.
Okay.
Believe it or not, in 1965, women had to be in their dormitories by 11 p.m. They waived that for the night. And they gave us these rooms, which
Right.
we met all night, and it was very dramatic, and it was interrupted by bomb threat, and we had to move outside and back in, and so there was an intensity about it, and a lot of people wrote about it as an important experience. I think of something by Brett Einen called "Something Exploded in My Mind."
Oh, really?
And so for a lot of people, it was the most intense educational experience that they had had at the University of Michigan, and they said that. And so I think that we went on from that and built on that, and there were teach-ins that were held around the country. That wasn't completely spontaneous. We were calling people
Right.
and asking them to hold them, and many of them did it within a week of the first teach-in, so that it became a national movement rather than simply
Right.
an event at the University of Michigan.
Right. And that then connects with the other topic for which you're very well known, which is social movements, social movement theory, and the relationship seems quite clear once you talk about it between questions of framing, organising people to understand a different frame, which would then work to be in their interests, I guess particularly student interests, who I'm sure they knew anyway that if they were going to be drafted, they were going to go to a pointless war, but to have the knowledge to work and understand it was then translating into large numbers of people moving from, again, awareness to action, I imagine.
Yeah, I think that there was a little bit of slowness to recognize the cultural dimension of social movements.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, there had been a reaction to earlier work on social movement theory that essentially treated social movement activity as irrational. People going crazy together was the phrase that was used.
Is that right?
Yeah. A lot of it was used to discredit the Nazis and and other movements that people had a very negative view of. But then it started getting applied to movements that people had more positive feelings about. So some people started applying it to the civil rights movement, for example. We just tried to divorce the notion of the importance of emotions and culture from that earlier tradition, but there was a sort of relative slowness before it was kind of recognized that, for example, that part, a very central part of the women's movement, for example, was cultural.
Yeah.
Not, it wasn't simply about policies of equal pay for equal work. There were all sorts of cultural aspects to it. So that started getting brought back in and really integrated into the thinking in a more and more central way. And I think the emphasis on framing contributed to that.
Sure. I imagine that the cultural question simply moves, as cultural studies has suggested, into some fairly complex but important aspects of the study of ideology, of what are the core values and social structures that are organising people's lives.
Yes, and again, I think there was a kind of change from an earlier view that ideologies rigidified people's thinking and so forth, to a recognition that it depends on the nature of the ideology, and there can be views that acknowledge ambiguities or uncertainties, and that it does not have to be a rigid, and there can be different differences in belief that will nevertheless people can be united despite these differences on behalf of a common cause that furthers both sides' view of the debate.
Right, so this goes from the kind of idea that society is mostly one very large structure that all agrees with one position. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Sense,
I mean, I think it sort of recognizes the existence of cultural differences and tries to put together understandings that cut across these cleavage lines. And addressing cleavages was a major part of the effort.
Right, absolutely. One of the comments that you've made, and this was back in the 90s, was that the central problematic of social movements is the mesh between the self and society, and the connection between the individual and society is a fascinating location to investigate. For me in particular, given if we jump to the contemporary situation, given the rise of social media and the focus that gives the individual on themselves, the kind of auto-ethnography.
Well, I think that's related to what still seems to me today to be a really major and important idea that should be kept into the field, and that's the notion of collective action frames having these three components. An injustice component, which is the key one, a identity component, and I'm blocking for a second on the third. The identity component and an agency component,
right,
in the sense that one can collectively do something about it. And the important insight that I think maybe was ignored earlier in the desire to keep emotions out of the equation was the notion that the injustice component was what psychologists call a hot cognition. It was emotionally laden.
Right.
It had righteous indignation attached to it.
Yes. Yes.
And that was important because that was what helped to unite and change, bring together the agency and the identity component into it. And the identity component has different levels, and I think that analysis remains important today. That is, you can identify at the level of a kind of underlying solidary group or social location that the constituency is coming from, or at the organizational level or at the movement level. And the most effective movements are integrating those so that the organization becomes an embodiment of the movement and the movement becomes an embodiment of the interests of that underlying constituency.
Right, great. And we're definitely now in a moment, having seen the election of a very conservative identitarian organisation, president, and the sense that this person Trump was trading to a large extent on a sense of injustice within the community. Very large numbers of people, poor or lower standards of living than they expected or have had, joblessness, shorter lives, all sorts of hopelessness that I think we should be fair in identifying as issues of justice.
I think that's a good point, and I think that yes, I think he did trade heavily on the sense of that people had of being left out, being betrayed, displaced, and that the Democratic Party tended to underrate that. Not so. I mean, I think that Bernie Sanders addressed it, and
sure.
And there are many people who feel that if he had been the candidate, he could have defeated Trump.
Sure.
But I think that there were, there were various ways in which Trump played on those feelings and tapped into those feelings.
Sure.
Now, it's true that, I think it's true that it did not cut across, it didn't really cut mustard beyond white voters, but it wasn't simply white working class voters, it was also those with post-secondary education white voters who supported Trump. So he was clearly tapping something deeper there.
Yeah, sure. And we've got, just in the couple of minutes we've got left, on the other side of the spectrum, of course, we've got the emergence of Black Lives Matter and the very important work that's happening there for a community in the minority community, African American folk in particular.
Yes.
A whole other kind of agency that they're demanding or organising through their social movement.
Well, I think that it is a very important movement, and I give the Occupy Wall Street people a lot of credit for changing the nature of the political discourse so that inequality became a legitimate aspect of the discourse, which it really was not before the Occupy Wall Street movement. And I think that it's true again that I think there's some sense in which Trump benefited from that too.
Well, that's an interesting point, isn't it?
Yeah. But it was still, I think, a really major contribution, and a lot of it was cultural. It was the impact on the discourse, on political discourse, and what could be talked about, and the extent to which one could talk about the unfairness of the tax code and things of that sort.
Sure. And I suspect that the focus on collective action that you've explored for so much of your career through either how it's influenced by framing or how it's influenced within social movement theory will continue to be an important, in fact rise very quickly to the surface in fields of sociology and media and cultural studies.
I hope so, and I do think that there are a lot of different competing organizations here that try to speak for the movement. There's better integration between, I think, the movement and a broader underlying set of groups that are affected by it. But there's no single organization that has a very strong claim of speaking for the movement. And to give a contrasting example, South Africa, involved a kind of integration, and that was part of the, achievement that the African National Congress became as spokesperson for the movement and the movement for the African people of African descent. So.
And that's a long arc, and we can finish up on that. The sort of social movement that was involved in removing apartheid from that country.
Yes.
A wonderful event. And then the movements that we're seeing now in US culture and US society, whether it's Black Lives Matter or whether it's whatever we will make of the next presidency after 2016. Well, Bill, thank you very much for your conversation.
Thank you for having me, and I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Bill. And that's it for tonight and for today. From me, Marcus Breen and Boston Media Theory. Until next time, it's good night and keep on doing the media.